Ring around the rosy, a pocket full of posies. Ashes, ashes, we all fall down.
So in the High Middle Ages, the plague comes really to Europe in the middle of the 14th century, but it had come actually before. A lot of people don't know that. The first instance of the plague actually is in the 6th century. It comes into Byzantium and into part of what becomes the Muslim world and parts of the Mediterranean, and then kind of disappears for a bit, but comes into medieval Europe in 1346, 1347. It comes with Genoese merchants who are traders in the Black Sea region, and then they bring it via boats into the ports of Genoa, and then from there it spreads through the ports of Italy, and then sort of northward and westward throughout Europe. I think the origins of the plague is still somewhat disputed. It certainly comes out of that kind of area of Western China. Whether or not it was carried by the Mongols, or maybe sort of carried by parts of the Mongols, say in 10% of the population that was susceptible to the plague, that's possible. Certainly it is that trade route, that sort of silk route, trade with China that goes through Mongolia with those nomadic populations and nomadic traders who come to the Black Sea. That's where the plague kind of has its origin. The main manifestations are that it affects the lungs. It's kind of tuberculoid in that sense, so it affects the lungs and the pneumatic system, but there are versions of the plague that also are septicemic, that is, it gets into the blood, and so one of the ways that it manifests itself is that there are buboes that form, which are these sort of like large pustules that are kind of discolored after a couple of days and turn kind of an ashy blackened color, so that's why it sort of becomes or acquires the name the Black Death, because people get that kind of ashen look to them. And then if those buboes burst, which they often did at sort of the end course of the disease or the infection, that's one of the main ways that it would spread to people who are caring for others with the plague. Certainly it also spread pneumonically, though, by coughing. Flea bite would be one way in which people could contract the plague, and then it would spread and people would spread it among themselves. But fleas would jump onto living animals, and it was very easy for them to get aboard rats that would then be ship-borne rats, and those rats would, move from ship to ship, and that's a great way so that even if you didn't have particular sailors or merchants, going on different vessels, the rats certainly would, and so they would spread it this way. So it's possible that fleas with a Mongolian trading group would have jumped onto rats that were aboard an Italian merchant ship, a Genoese merchant ship, and then it would go from there. And I mean, my understanding, although as far as I know there aren't medieval sources that say this, but the fleas that are infected with the plague would then infect the rats would die. Just as today, plague is still not rampant, not epidemic by any means, but still manifest even here in Boulder, and sometimes there are squirrels and other prairie dogs that die of the plague, right? So other animals can certainly get the plague if they're bitten. So presumably these rats died off on the ship, and then the fleas jumped onto the next living creature they could find, which would be human beings, and then the human beings got it and transmitted it among themselves, but also via the fleas that they then shared with their home populations. So yeah. Religion is one way that people kind of coped with the manifestation of the plague, and I think a lot of people began to turn inward to think that this was the manifestation of the anger of God with the population. Maybe they were being too sinful, so he brings plague upon them or plagues them in this particular way. Within Christian groups in Europe, they interpret this as maybe one of the signs of the coming of the apocalypse. I think for much of the Middle Ages, a kind of underlying current of apocalypticism or worrying about the end of the world is kind of always present in certain aspects of Christianity and of certain movements of Christianity, and the plague certainly feeds into that. It also comes at a time when Europe is plagued by or in the midst of a war, the 100 Years' War. It comes following a great famine that hit and really decimated, affected, killed off 10% of Northern Europe. So they're thinking about it, as I say, in apocalyptic terms and as one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse. Plague, war, famine, all these things that would sort of spread death and decimation. So I think people become very worried about this, and then one of the ways that they respond to it is to become more penitential. That is, they try to be better Christians, and sometimes in a very visceral way. They walk around and pray publicly. This also corresponds to the sort of heightened moment of the flagellant movement, when people would take their clothes off, either stripped out naked or partially naked, and would flagellate themselves, whip themselves publicly, sometimes processing from town to town for 33 days. 33 days, of course, the number of days that Christ lived in years, they believed. So it becomes, there are many public responses to the plague. The Jews seem like an obvious group, an out group that has already been kind of cast out in some ways. Moreover, there's been a long history up through the 14th century of concern about Jewish populations potentially causing harm to Christian populations. None of this generally is founded, but these are the myths that Christian groups will tell to themselves. There's a long history of the Jewish blood libel, or accusations of host desecration, that Jewish groups would come together and find a host that's used for the Mass and the Eucharist and desecrate it in some way as a way of kind of working against the Christian religion and other Christian groups. And so I think, we need to see the anti-Semitism that comes out of the plague in relation to some of those other things that are happening in European history and Christian-Jewish relations. But definitely one manifestation of this is that Christian groups accuse the Jews of spreading the plague. Most people counter this and can say, look, Jewish populations are dying just as quickly and are just as susceptible. And part of it is a kind of coping strategy. I think many people within Europe tried to find scapegoats or people or groups to blame for the plague. Some people blame lepers. I mean, there are other people who are accused other than groups of Jews at this particular time in medieval history. That kind of anti-Semitism is part of a kind of popular wellspring of feeling and anxiety that's maybe exacerbated by certain notions of sort of fervent Christianity. But most people, I think, can see that this is not the case. And there are some sources that talk about that, so we often focus on the kind of anti-Semitism that happens in Europe for many, many reasons, but I think the majority of the population doesn't always see it that way and has working relationships with Christians and Jews who live side by side